Hi friends, and welcome back to my channel. Today I would like to talk about a book that I have not stopped thinking about since I finished it yesterday, and that is Babel, or as the original title is, I have to read it because it's not actually on this book, Babel, or The Necessity of Violence, an arcane history of the Oxford Translators' Revolution. Yes, it's a mouthful, but I think the entire title is completely justified, and I'll go into exactly why. Now, if you like dark academia, this is your book. If you love languages, this is your book. If you like world building, this is your book. And if you like colonial critique and you haven't read it, I think you get it. But you should be warned that Babel is not just here to vibe as an aesthetic. It is going to punch you in the face with historical rage and moral ambiguity. So what is Babel actually about? I can put this down now. So what is Babel actually about? This story is set in alternate history, so the 1830s England. It follows Robin Swift, who is a Chinese orphan who is taken from China to England and raised in that setting and trained up as a translator to go and study at and then work at Oxford University, specifically the Royal Translation Institute, which is otherwise known as Babel. Yes, it is named after the mythological tower where humans tried to reach up to God, and so God decided to confuse all of their language so that they wouldn't be able to achieve that. So this is Oxford, but it has a dark magical twist. In this setting, they use silver and language to create magic and fuel imperial power. There's a whole system of magic that I'll go into a little bit later. But they have used this magic that they have available to them in order to assert continuing dominance over the rest of the world. As Robin grows up within this machine of academia, he starts to realize that his role as a translator in this world is part of a much larger system of exploitation. And the further he goes, the harder it becomes to reconcile his love of language with the violence that it enables. So let's talk about what worked really well in this novel. I loved the world building. You can tell that R.F. Kuang put so much time and energy into researching this properly. If I'm correct, I think she was also a student at Oxford at one point, so she has that insider perspective. And the magic isn't just there to be a fantasy detail that's like fun. It actually like reinforces the structures of colonialism in the world. It's a magic system that is based on the idea of things being lost in translation and the gap between meanings of two different words being translated from one language to another. If you're a language nerd, this is going to hit so hard. Also, the themes: colonialism, resistance, complicity, identity, language, violence. It's all there, and it is not subtle. Nor should it be. Kuang isn't afraid to make you uncomfortable, and I respect the hell out of that. I also have to say I love the footnotes. Some people hate it, other people love it. I happen to fall into the loves it category. It gives the book this faux academic, logical texture that works so well in contrast to the emotional turmoil that these characters go through. Now, is it a perfect book? No. It is a chonker. The pacing does drag in parts, especially if you're expecting it to be like a traditional fantasy story arc. It is a slow burn political tragedy. It's not a plot twist every chapter sort of story. Also, some characters do sort of come across as more like mouthpieces to certain ideologies rather than fully fleshed out individuals. But weirdly, I think that might be part of the point. The book isn't trying to be character-driven in the traditional sense. It's a narrative thesis, I would go so far as to say, and it aims to drive the message home through the emotions that it creates in you. Because that's what we take with us when we finish the story and we go into the rest of our lives, and it becomes part of the values that we decide to embody as we make choices and live our lives. Now, reading Babel, there's debate over which one's right. I'm gonna go with Babel. Reading Babel brought up some really personal feelings for me. I studied English literature at the University of Queensland, which is basically Australia's, or at least Queensland's, sandstone cliche university. And back then I didn't really take academia as seriously as I wish I had now. I loved my classes, I was obsessed with the texts, the theory, the analysis, but I feel like I always kept one foot out the door because I didn't I got cut off. Conspiracy. I felt like I wasn't smart enough to make it a career in academia, and I wish I had applied myself a bit more. And now reading a book like this, it made me wish that I leaned in more, that's all. I wish I had seen myself as someone who could have made a space for myself within that intellectual sphere, to become a contributor and not just a student. But here we are. So I mentioned that the full title of Babel, or A Necessity of Violence, is often overlooked. And while the narrative does embody physical acts of rebellion, the concept of violence here is multifaceted, extending beyond the physical realm. The Oxford English Dictionary itself defines violence not only as a physical force intended to harm or damage, but also as the use of power to effect unjust changes. This broader interpretation invites the reader to consider how language itself can become a vehicle for violence. In their study, Coates and Wilde analysed how language can be employed to conceal violence, shift blame, and pathologise victims. These linguistic strategies can perpetrate harm and injustice without any physical force being employed. Babel delves into this notion by illustrating how the act of translation can serve as a tool of imperialism. The manipulation of language becomes a means of control, erasure, and domination. And this perspective challenges us to recognize that words are not just passive conveyors of meaning, but can actively participate in systems of oppression. As someone who's always cherished the power of words, this realization is both enlightening and unsettling, and it prompts a deeper reflection on how language can either uphold or dismantle systems, structures of power, and how our choices in communication can either perpetrate or challenge injustices. Now, because it's NAIDOC week, I couldn't help but reflect as I was reading Babel on the very real consequences that empire has had in Australia, on the lives, the languages, and the cultures of First Nations people. What the book explores through metaphor, how translation can become a form of extraction, how empire flattens linguistic difference for the sake of control. It isn't abstract here. It's history, it's ongoing. We see it in the hundreds of Aboriginal languages that were suppressed and erased. We see it in the way that these cultures were treated as something to be civilized out rather than protected. Even now, you can see how colonial logic still shapes what's considered to be normal knowledge. For example, in Australian schools, we teach our children the European seasons, winter, spring, summer, and autumn, as if they are universal truths, but in Australia, those seasons a lot of the time don't make sense. The climate simply doesn't follow those rules. The Yagara and Turrbal people whose, land Brisbane currently occupies traditionally recognize 6 seasons, based not just on temperature, but on patterns of rain and plant cycles and animal life. That knowledge is deeply attuned to the rhythms of this place, and yet it is not what we grow up learning. In fact, I could go on about how, us European settlers insisted that we bring our own grains and our own cattle, and we cultivate it just like we would have done in England. But it's actually kind of sucked for the environment here. And if we were to return to more native produce as like Australian cuisine, it would be so much better for us and the land and country. I don't know, it's just something that Babel made me think about. The thing that nobody really told me about about Babel, that it doesn't just talk about revolution, it shows you how to make it happen. It walks you step by step through the radicalization process. How idealistic students working within the system slowly realize that the system was never built to include them, that reform is a fantasy, and that resistance means risk, and that sometimes violence isn't a failure of morality, it's a last resort for survival. Babel dares to ask, what happens when knowledge and theory isn't enough? Now, surprisingly, Babel is not banned in Australia or in any other countries that I'm aware of. The novel is widely available through all bookstores and libraries. However, the book was controversially excluded from the Hugo Awards in 2023, which were held in Chengdu, China. Despite receiving enough nominations to qualify, Babel was marked as not eligible without explanation. This led to widespread speculation that the exclusion was due to political censorship. Given the book's, hang on, I'm going to read this part. Given the book's critical stance on colonialism and its focus on British imperialism in China, leaked emails from the Hugo Awards administration suggested that works with politically sensitive content were deliberately excluded to avoid issues with Chinese authorities. So if you needed some hot tea to go with this book, there it is. So, would I recommend Babel? Yes, but only if you're ready for it. It's dense, it's footnoted, it's emotionally brutal, and absolutely not escapist. You do not go to this book if you want to forget about the world. You go to this book to learn about the world. But if you're willing to be challenged, if you want a book that asks big, painful, necessary questions, then this one is unforgettable. It's not just about magic or rebellion or books. It's about what we lose when we try to make the world speak only one language, and what we might have to do to reclaim our own. Let me know if you've read Babel, or if it's on your list. What did it stir up for you? If you're Australian, I encourage you to look at your local seasonal calendar, just as a tiny little act of resistance against colonialism, just girly things. Drop your thoughts below. As always, like, subscribe, comment, and stay curious. See you next time. This is for the thumbnail.